And welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where I'm going to pull the microphone in front of me so you can maybe hear what I have to say if you're so inclined. Today, it's all about Traffic, one of my very favorite bands of all time. And they were a band that really did it their way at all times. The history of Traffic can really be divided into two periods. There was the first period of Traffic in the 60s, in which they released Mr. Fantasy and their self-titled album, and then there was the second period of Traffic, which came between 1970 and 74. And it's this second period where I think the band was really at its best, because they had by this time abandoned all of the pretenses of trying to write 3-minute singles, and they were fully dedicated to the idea of extended songs with a lot of improvisation, a lot of jamming, and nevertheless, the improv and the jamming all came within the context of music that was really crafted well. In other words, their songwriting ability got better and better, but what they did with the songs was more interesting and more interesting. Now, what genre was Traffic? And this is something that no one can really agree on. There was a wonderful Frank Zappa interview on MTV in the early 80s, and they were doing a special on progressive rock. And they gave him a long list of bands that were generally popular in the 60s and 70s. And they asked Frank which ones are prog rock. And he had some interesting things to say. He said his own music is not prog rock. And he went even further and said, I'm not even sure if my music is rock and roll at all. And he said something similar about Traffic, that they were not prog rock, although there were certain elements of prog rock in there which might make others think otherwise. Well, were they a jazz group? They had jazz elements in the music. Were they jazz fusion? Kind of. And this is where it gets even more interesting if we're going to try to place Traffic somewhere in this wide web of genres. Jazz fusion is typically a term that's applied to bands that have a kind of jazz pedigree, but are playing music where there's amplification of guitars, electric keyboards, electric bass, etc. There's sometimes a sort of rocky backbeat that will appear rhythmically every now and that generally it's jazz plugged in, is sort of a simple definition of fusion. And if that were the case, Traffic would fit the bill, except for the fact that the guys in Traffic came from a background that was really in folk music, in singer-songwriting, and in the beat music of the day. You could also say that there was a blues background because Steve Winwood, before he formed Traffic, was in the Spencer Davis Group, which was very much a pop blues band. You'll obviously remember them for such hits as Gimme Some Lovin', a sort of Stevie Winwood standout. They called him Little Stevie Winwood before he just became Steve Winwood. Traffic would play it live, but a very different version of Gimme Some Lovin' in their live concerts. And so when it really comes down to it, I think that Traffic are kind of sort of their own genre. Because again, they're a band that jam, but they're not a jam band. They have elements of prog rock, elements of jazz fusion, elements of folk, lots of elements of singer-songwriting. But I think it was their ability to improvise so well that really made them stand out at a time when improvisation in rock, outside of the prog rock world, was generally on the slow road to becoming less significant. Luckily, there's a lot of really good video of this second period of Traffic from 70 to 74 that's out there. Around this time, I think around 70, 71, they did maybe 72. In fact, let me look it up because why not? That's the glory of doing these things. They did a concert in Santa Monica. This was in 72 at the legendary Santa Monica Civic Center, which I just read that they're going to try not to demolish, which would be a great thing. It's a great place. And this was a pretty lengthy concert captured on video, and you can buy it, you can stream it, it's all over YouTube. So look it up because that concert is really, really representative of just how good Traffic were on stage at this time. And then from a year later, there's some video that was released on YouTube from Musikladen, which was the name of the German show Beat Club. It changed its name around this time, but it was the same basic concept: bands in a television studio with no audience playing really good music. And so you can go to their YouTube channel and you can see all sorts of great videos from Traffic of that era. And I think one of the reasons that the band also worked so well was its three core members: Jim Capaldi on drums, vocals, writing, lyrics, and the basic, I would call him the sort of lodestone of the band. The Traffic sort of reflected Jim Capaldi's esoteric approach to life, his musical sense of adventure, his musical sense of freedom, his sense of spirituality being something that can be communicated through music. Then the other element that was so important in shaping the sound, particularly the jazzy and improvisational element: Chris Wood, wonderful flautist and saxophonist, just so good. And in many ways, sonically, he helped to give Traffic such a distinct identity with his playing of the flute and the saxophone. And then, of course, Steve Winwood, one of the best voices of all time in popular and rock music. And he was someone who was equally comfortable on piano, organ, and guitar, a true virtuoso, a wunderkid, as they once called him. And those three core members really created a sound unlike any other. And it's there on the first two studio albums, but it's really, really there on the final albums in that second period. So obviously, the first album of that second period was John Barleycorn Must Die. Wonderful album from start to finish, not a bad track on it. They followed that up with an equally strong album, Low Spark of High Heeled Boys, noted for its very interesting and oddly shaped cover. Check that out. Look at the original vinyl cover. Then a kind of sequel to that album was Shootout at the Fantasy Factory. Wonderful stuff. And they wrapped it all up with a very uniquely beautiful album, When the Eagle Flies. If I were you and you really wanted to get into Traffic, definitely check out those albums in particular. But listen to all of it and the live stuff, because they released two live albums in their heyday, with more later. Because even though Chris Wood sadly died at the end of the 70s, Capaldi and Winwood got back together in the early 90s. They performed at Woodstock 94. That video's online. And while the 60s and 70s stuff was the best, it's still a pretty good performance. So check that out too. Traffic, what can you say? I think you can tell I really like these guys. Like, subscribe if you like me, and we will see you next time. Take care.